Well, let's just finish off John chapter 4. We are, of course, looking at the official, the Herodian, who wants his son to be healed. And again, I draw your attention to the the context, because, of course, it's following this story about the Samaritan woman and this revival in Samaria. And then, of course, in chapter 5, there's a following healing of a man in Jerusalem. All right, and the context is very important because these are not unconnected stories. Okay, the whole point is that there's this message that John is putting across. These are all case examples of how you can see that faith in God is what matters, not your background, your pedigree, or your approval of the authorities. All right, Nicodemus, of course, high-ranking Pharisee, ruling council, teacher of Israel, the perfect Jew as far as most Jews were concerned, and then, of course, you have this Samaritan woman. The Samaritans are hated and she's a woman of ill repute, and then you've got this Herodian official's son. Okay, now the Herodians were hated. Herod was a puppet king imposed by the Romans on Israel, on the Jewish people, and he taxed them to the hilt. By some estimates, and I don't know how accurate they are, so please don't quote me on it, but by some estimates, people were actually having to give nearly all of their money. They weren't just doing a proportion. We think we complain because we have to pay something like 30 or 40% tax. They were paying way higher, right? And he was absolutely, just obscenely wealthy. He built palaces. He built a mountain to build a palace on at one point because he wanted a mountain in a certain place, so he had a mountain built. I mean, the man was extraordinary. He also, of course, was famous for building the temple in Jerusalem. All right, great, you think, wonderful. He's very favourable towards the Jews, but of course he also gave a lot of money to build pagan temples to the Romans and Greek gods and all this kind of stuff. And so actually he was despised. Above all, he personally was an Edomite. Okay, now the Edomites were long-standing enemies of Israel. They rejoiced when Jerusalem was destroyed. They helped. They were actually a major part in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Most people think of that as a Roman thing. Yes, it was led by the Romans, but they recruited all of their soldiers from the provinces, and so most of them are actually the same people as attacked the Israelites today. They were Arabic people, Edomite people, Semitic peoples from around there, and they threw themselves into the destruction of AD 70 with gusto. That's why the Romans couldn't control them, because they went over and above what they were told to do. So anyway, that's another subject. But the thing is that there's this long-standing hatred, as we said, between the Samaritans and the Jews, but also the Herodians. That's why it's all the more remarkable when you read those passages where the Herodians and the Jewish authorities get together to gang up on Jesus, because it shows just how far they would go to get rid of Jesus. All right, long-standing enemies became friends because of that. All united in their hatred of Jesus. Now this man personally, he's not only Herodian official, as a royal official, because Herod was the only king in that area. Anybody who was Roman, by the way, would be called imperial because they had an empire, but Herod was a king, so he had royal officials. Well, if he's a man of some importance, he could have just sent a servant, or summoned Jesus, said, come here, come and see me. But instead, this man shows he's got a different character, because he goes in person. He doesn't send a servant, and he doesn't summon Jesus. He goes in person. He humbles himself, and he approaches Jesus with some humility. All right, and this is quite important. All right, because it shows where the man's heart was. Even though he worked for Herod, it shows that actually he had a slightly different character. All right. Now, what's interesting is that Jesus seems to almost rebuke him. He says, unless you see signs and wonders, you'll not believe. But in fact, you'll find that the word "you" here, I think, is in the plural. And it's like Jesus is not necessarily talking to him, All right, he's talking to the crowd, perhaps, or he's talking to people in general. Right? There's a similar thing in John 3 actually when he's speaking to Nicodemus. Like Nicodemus approached him supposedly on his own, and then he says, "We know." And sometimes it's you in the plural, that means more than one, so he's talking to a crowd, or it's you singular. But in this particular case, it's you plural. All right. So is Jesus speaking to him? Possibly not. He's possibly speaking to the crowd. And this is part of the problem. You see, there were lots of people who followed Jesus just looking for signs and wonders. He was an entertainment. Let's go and see a great miracle. It's like the circus has come to town. Well, the problem with that is that they don't really want God. They don't even really want healings. They just want entertaining. And sad to say, this is probably something that afflicts people nowadays. People go to meetings or whatever else because they want something other than God. They might go for food. That's fine. Christmas celebration coming up. Let's go and get fat. Why not? But actually, ultimately, deep down, certainly we as Christians should be there for God. And we should go there for fellowship, not just to see the crack or hear what's going on or see the entertainment or pick apart the preacher. People go with the wrong motives, and sometimes I think that's what's behind some of the very flamboyant Pentecostal meetings that you see in America. The sort of like the falling down in crowds and all that kind of stuff. It's because people want to go for a thrill, and they don't really want the things of God. In fact, it's one of my favourite testimonies. I have a friend who was a missionary. I say a friend, I haven't seen him for years actually. But he was a missionary, and the Lord laid it on his heart. This is going slightly off topic. This has got nothing to do with John 4 really, but the Lord laid it on his heart to prophesy to everybody who came to the meeting. And people would come forward and he would share what was laid on his heart. And he said eventually somebody came forward and suddenly he just drew a blank. He had absolutely nothing to say. And he said, "Lord, give me something to say. This is embarrassing." Just blank. And he looked at the man helplessly and said, "I'm sorry, I haven't got anything. Nothing's coming to me." Right? And afterwards he was speaking to the local pastor. The local pastor said, "That was brilliant. That was perfect." He said, "Why?" He said, "That man for years and years and years has been coming to meetings looking for this, looking for that, and he comes for a while and he's happy, and then he gets bored and he goes to a different church, and then he gets bored and he goes to a different church, and then he gets bored and he goes to a different church, and he goes to crusades and outreaches and things like that, looking for things, right?" And he said he wants all the thrills and spills of being a Christian. He said, but he will not commit to being a Christian. He will not commit to following God. He will not repent of his sins and actually knuckle down and be faithful to God. I thought, yeah, that's quite an interesting sort of a testimony, isn't it? Because he said, unless you see signs and wonders, this is what it comes down to. You should really want the things of God. Now, these people, this crowd, they're all following Jesus. They want to see healings. They want to see signs and wonders. They want to see something spectacular. But what happens here? The son is healed. So the man receives a healing. The boy is healed. But it doesn't happen where they can see it. They are deprived of the very thing that they've followed him around. They follow him, they walk up and down the countryside following Jesus, and then they're deprived. When the miracle happens, they can't see it. Right? So I think and God knows exactly what he's doing. He knows how to handle people. As it said in the previous chapter, he doesn't need a testimony to know what's in the heart of a man. He knows all men, and he knows that they're there for the wrong reasons. And he wants them to get bored and go away, or believe and come and come into a relationship with God, actually come into a commitment. All right. So I think that's really important. And it's with all of that, then the situation just looks a little bit more complex. The other thing is, of course, this is a Gentile. Well, we're saying he's a Gentile. Actually, we don't know that. He worked for Herodian, for Herod, so he's an Herodian. And the thing is that the Jews wanted their Messiah to come and pat them on the head and said, "Aren't you a good little boy?" All the Pharisees were expecting the Messiah to come through and say, "My boys, I'm here," and he didn't. He was quite the opposite. Of course, we've seen the temple clearing, and we've seen Jesus speaking to the Samaritan, and now he's going to this hated Herodian. The Gentiles and the half-breeds and the hated enemies, the political enemies, they're all getting the healings. They're getting their prayers answered. The Messiah's come for them. But the Jews are getting nothing. The Jews are being deprived. Right? Now, why is this? And the simple reason is they want the things of God, but they don't want God. They wanted the healings, but they don't want God. They want to see the miracles, but they don't want to hear the word of God. They want the temple, they want the priesthood, they want the sacrifice, but they're not interested in forgiveness. They're not interested in getting close to God. And this is the thing. Do we want the things of God, or do we want God himself? If we want the things of God, but not God, then God will not give us the things of God either. We'll end up with nothing. Because the gospel is fundamentally, it's about a restoration of a relationship between God and man. Between me and God, you and God, us and God. Okay? It's not about making us all well or giving us what we want. He wants to do that because he's a loving father. But, what if you had a child who only came to see you when he wanted pocket money? After a while you just stop giving him any money. Because you just say, look, son, why don't you come to me? You're not coming to me, you're coming to my wallet. Come to me instead, So, anyway, enough said. So, this is the thing. He shows that he's got faith, and Jesus responds by commanding his healing. I think it's also interesting that he just commands it with a word, no long, lengthy prayers or anything really complicated, no great ceremony. What's also interesting is this, that he becomes a believer, and he and all his household. And what's very interesting is actually that elsewhere we have hints as to who that might be, because in Luke chapter 8 we see that one of the women who accompanied and supported Jesus financially was Joanna, and she was the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. All right. So is it possible that after the boy got healed, then his wife started to actually support Jesus financially and going around cooking for them or looking after them or reaching out to people, sitting at his feet and learning, and really following Jesus closely? There's this wonderful thought that actually that they would have fulfilled a great role there. And maybe it's because the boy got healed here in what we call John 4. All right. So that leads us on to, let's just finish up. What is the sign? Right now, this is described as the second sign. Okay, this was the second sign that Jesus did when he came out of Judah. Okay, so what is it? Is it the fact that somebody was healed? Well, we're not even told actually what he's healed of, not in detail. So why is it a sign? He's healed at a distance. Is that somehow the sign? He heals one of their enemies. Is that somehow a sign? It's interesting. What is interesting, I think, is actually the thing that really stands out to me, because we don't really know what the sign is. I think that that's part of the mystery of this passage, is that it's all the sort of Gentiles that Jesus is reaching out to. Now, it was one of the big objections that the Jews had to Jesus. He can't be really the Messiah because he went to the Gentiles. They didn't like the idea of a Messiah who went to the Gentiles, and yet, actually, all the way through the Old Testament, the great glorious vision of the Messianic age is when the nations would come in and be embraced as part of Israel. So actually, the Jewish objection to Jesus is presented by John in this gospel as the reason to believe in him, because it fulfills Scripture. All right. So, sometimes we sort of try to emphasize to Jews, oh yeah, but Jesus went to the Jews. Actually, we should be emphasizing, no, Jesus went to the Gentiles, and that proves that he's the Messiah. All right. The other thing that we see actually in the book of Glory, in the second half of the gospel, is that Jesus suffers, and that's also a major objection to the Jews. accepting Jesus. They'd say, oh, he can't be the Messiah because he suffered and died. But actually, of course, prophecy repeats and repeats and repeats that he would be the righteous suffering servant of Yahweh. Okay, and so therefore he is definitely the Messiah. Their objections are actually the reasons that they should believe. Okay, so there's quite a few possibilities there. And I don't think it's meant to be conclusive. I don't think it's supposed to be clear. I think John is deliberately making it slightly mysterious so that it's a puzzle to engage you as a reader, because the idea is that you should be able to debate that, and work it over in your mind. So I hope that clears up John 4. We'll move on to John 5 now. And I hope you've also seen the video on the I am sayings, because that's got some key information in it which really covers a lot of the references throughout the Gospel.